The forest did not just grow around the house, it seemed to hold it in a suffocating grip. Samer stood before the rotting wooden frame, his boots sinking into a carpet of damp, decaying leaves. Dense fog rolled through the trees, thick and gray, erasing the path he had walked only moments ago. He took a single step toward the porch, but the silence of the woods felt heavy, unnatural. The local legend hung in the air like the humidity itself. Those who stepped inside this threshold did not return. He looked back, but the mist had already closed the gap behind him, turning the world into a featureless void. He was alone. The house groaned under the weight of decades, the wood warped and splintered by rot. Samer raised his flashlight, the beam cutting a weak, flickering path through the gloom. The front door stood slightly ajar, a dark, jagged opening that seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic patience. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the peeling grain of the timber. Every instinct hammered in his chest, a warning he chose to ignore. He took a breath, steeled his resolve, and gripped the rusted handle. The door gave way with a low, agonizing protest of rusted hinges. Samer stepped inside, his boots crunching sharply on a thick carpet of shattered glass. The air immediately changed, thick and heavy with the scent of wet earth and ancient, undisturbed dust. He swung his flashlight in a slow arc, the beam catching cobwebs that hung like curtains across the foyer. Behind him, the wind outside seemed to vanish. Without a draft or a hand to guide it, the heavy wooden door swung shut with a final, booming thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The latch clicked into place with a definitive, metallic snap. Samer spun around, his light dancing frantically over the solid timber, but there was no handle on the inside. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against his ears like deep water. He turned back to the parlor, the beam of his light trembling as he took his first steps into the dark heart of the structure. The house was no longer a destination, it was a container. He adjusted his grip on the camera, his knuckles white, and pressed forward into the gloom. Samer lifted his camera, the mechanical whir of the lens adjusting to the dark sounding like a gunshot in the stagnant air. He moved through the parlor, capturing the decay. Dust motes danced in his flashlight beam, settling on furniture draped in heavy, gray sheets. He paused near a fireplace, the camera shutter clicking rhythmically as he documented the stillness. The house held its breath. Then, the ceiling groaned. A deep, rhythmic thudding started directly above him, slow and deliberate, as if something massive were pacing the floorboards of the second story. Samer stopped, his camera lowering toward the floor. He held his breath, but his lungs forced it out in a jagged, visible plume of white mist. The temperature in the room plummeted, the air turning sharp and biting against his skin. The thudding grew louder, vibrating through the ceiling plaster and rattling the glass in the window frames. He did not move. He did not look away. Every muscle in his body locked, his fingers tightening around the camera grip until his knuckles ached. The sound was not wind, nor settling wood. It was a rhythmic, heavy tread that suggested something was pacing in the dark, waiting for him to notice. The rhythmic thudding ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a vacuum of sound that rang in his ears. From the black throat of the hallway ahead, a woman's laughter drifted out. It was light, hollow, and carried no warmth. Samer gripped his flashlight until his hand cramped and took a hesitant step forward. The hallway responded. The walls groaned, the wood grain twisting and sliding against itself like muscle. As he walked, the corridor seemed to elongate, the floor tilting almost imperceptibly as if the house were inhaling. Each stride felt like wading through deep water, his boots dragging against boards that felt soft and yielding under his weight. He tried to turn back, but the space behind him had already blurred into an endless, narrow tunnel of shifting shadows. The laughter sounded again, closer now, echoing from the very walls he touched. He pushed forward, driven by an instinct he could not name, as the architecture warped to guide him toward the far end. The air grew thinner, tasting of ozone and rot. He reached out to steady himself, but the wall pulsed beneath his palm, a rhythmic vibration that mimicked a heartbeat. He was no longer walking, he was being funneled. The corridor finally surrendered, depositing him before a heavy iron door embedded in the wall. It was cold to the touch, the metal pitted with rust and damp with condensation. Samer raised his flashlight, expecting a locked barrier, but the door groaned and swung inward on its own. He did not push it. It moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, revealing the darkness beyond. He stepped across the threshold, his boots clicking softly on the floor. The beam of his light cut through the gloom, hitting the opposite wall and stopping dead. The room was lined with hundreds of framed photographs, covering every inch of space from floor to ceiling. They were arranged in perfect, suffocating rows. The silence here was thick, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. He swept his light across the surface of the walls, illuminating rows of faces frozen in time. There was no dust here, no rot, only the stare of countless subjects looking back from the frames. He stood in the center, his flashlight beam trembling as he realized the sheer scale of the collection. Every frame was identical, heavy and dark. He stopped moving, his pulse thudding in his neck. As the weight of the observation settled over him, the house had stopped its shifting, waiting for him to look closer. Samer walked to the nearest wall and held his light steady. The first photograph showed a man in a field, his expression frozen in mid-laugh. Behind him, a tall, featureless shadow loomed, its elongated fingers resting on the man's shoulder. Samer frowned and moved to the next frame. A woman sitting at a table. The same shadow stood directly behind her. He scanned a third, a fourth, a dozen more. In every single image, regardless of the era or the subject, the tall, dark figure was there. It hovered just behind the person, its posture predatory and still. He felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the pattern. These were not just portraits, they were records of a hunt. He traced the glass of a frame with his thumb, his hand shaking. The shadow in the photo seemed to darken, its edges bleeding into the background of the image. He looked at the next row, then the next, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. Hundreds of people, hundreds of lives, all marked by the same silent, looming presence. He was not just looking at a collection of photos. He was looking at a gallery of victims, all trapped in the same inescapable fate. His light darted across the wall, searching for a break in the pattern, but the rows continued into the darkness. Then, the beam locked onto a frame near the center. It looked different. The glass was not cold, and the paper beneath it was glossy, lacking the age-worn patina of the others. Samer stepped closer, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the surface of the print. The image was perfectly clear. It was a photograph of himself, standing in this exact room, his hand raised to the wall. He had been captured only seconds ago. His gaze shifted to his own shoulder in the picture. A tall, ink-black form stood behind him, its featureless face tilted toward his ear, its mouth stretched into a jagged, impossible grin. The air in the room turned frigid. Samer yanked his hand back, his breath hitching in a sharp, jagged sob. The camera slipped from his grip, hitting the floor with a hollow crack as the lens splintered into a web of glass. Panic ignited, white-hot and absolute. He spun around, his boots skidding on the floor, and lunged toward the iron door. He had to get out. He had to run. He did not look back at the wall. Samer hit the hallway at a dead run, his feet hammering against floorboards that felt soft, almost pliable, beneath his weight. He reached the end of the corridor, his hands outstretched to grip the frame of the front door. His fingers met only solid, smooth wall. He slammed his palms against the wood, searching for a latch, a seam, a crack. Nothing. The door was gone. He spun around, chest heaving, his flashlight beam swinging wildly through the dark. The corridor had changed. Walls that were straight seconds ago now curved inward, closing the space like a tightening throat. He lunged back the way he came, but the hallway stretched, elongating into a dark, impossible tunnel. The wood beneath his boots groaned, shifting like a living thing. Then, the walls began to pulse. A low, guttural vibration hummed against his skin, rhythmic and heavy. Unintelligible whispers bled from the timber, overlapping into a chaotic drone that drowned out his own frantic breathing. He hammered his fists against the wall, but the surface yielded like wet clay, absorbing the impact. He was no longer in a house. He was inside an organism, and it was sealing him in. Samer pivoted, the flashlight beam stuttering against the pulsating timber. He shook the device, his thumb frantic against the switch, but the light gave one final, violent pulse and died. The darkness was not just an absence of sight. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. He stood paralyzed, his own heartbeat the only sound in the suffocating void. Then, the ambient vibration of the walls ceased, replaced by a sudden, unnatural stillness. A sharp drop in temperature pricked his skin, the air turning ice cold. He turned his head, sensing a presence crowding his personal space, though he saw nothing. A breath, frigid and smelling of wet earth, brushed against the side of his neck. He tried to scream, but his throat tightened, as if gripped by unseen fingers. From the empty air, directly behind his ear, a voice emerged. It was not a single sound, but a layered, distorted chorus of overlapping tones, vibrating through his skull. It rasped with terrifying intimacy. "Now, you belong to us." The words echoed, settling into the grain of the walls. Samer felt his resistance dissolve into the dark, his presence in the house finally and permanently claimed. Sunlight cut through the forest canopy, hitting the rotting exterior of the house as the morning breeze stirred the heavy branches. Villagers gathered at the edge of the clearing, their voices low, eyes fixed on the structure that had held its secrets for generations. The heavy iron door, previously sealed, now swung aimlessly on its hinges, striking the frame with a rhythmic, hollow clack. They stepped inside, boots scraping against the debris of the foyer. The parlor was still, the air stagnant and thick with the smell of dust. They moved toward the hallway, their presence echoing in the emptiness. At the end of the corridor, the iron room stood open. The walls were covered in hundreds of framed faces, a mosaic of lost lives. Every subject stared back with the same fixed expression, each one haunted by the tall, dark shadow looming behind them. The villagers stopped in the center of the room. Their eyes drifted to a new frame, mounted perfectly straight in a fresh spot. The glass caught the morning light. It showed a young man holding a dead flashlight, his face frozen in a mask of absolute terror. Directly behind him, a dark, faceless figure stood close, its jagged mouth curved into a permanent, silent smile. The house was empty, but the wall had grown.